Now we move on to our third speaker, Patrick Worms, who is a Cambridge-educated molecular geneticist and represents World Agroforestry. Over to you, Patrick, please.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Marvelous. So I'm going to be telling you about the role of land management in the climate crisis. It's not climate change. Climate change is something that we've been doing for quite a while. Climate change is something that humans started doing about 8,000 years ago when they discovered agriculture. And agriculture is something you do by clearing land, which puts carbon in the air, or if you're in Southeast Asia and you invented wet rice agriculture, by having paddy fields, and paddy fields put a lot of methane in the air. And so what you see is that the observed levels of methane and CO2 have been changing for thousands of years, and that the observed climate is actually quite different from the climate that you would expect if you had simply followed astronomical climate forcing things. The problem with that, of course, is that today we have boosted that process substantially. The pre-industrial warming that we have accumulated, plus the very short industrial warming that we've been doing for roughly a century and a half or so, has already pushed us above 2 degrees warmer than it would have been the case had humans simply stayed in their trees. We've been slow at recognizing the problem, but we recognized the problem in the early 1990s, and we did what the world does best. We started talking about it, and we talk about it in big things called COPs, Conferences of the Parties. They have failed. What this chart shows is the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere overlaid over every single COP. None of these COPs had any impact in terms of slowing the process. On the contrary, emission rates keep on going up. And they keep on going up because carbon, oh my God, carbon, it's better than heroin, it's better than speed, it's the best drug ever invented, and everybody wants it. We tend to think of carbon dioxide pollution, of greenhouse gas pollution, as only being a problem from the rich countries on the left. But when you look at this chart, which I'll remind you is logging the increases in emissions on a log scale, it's affecting everybody. Poor countries like Afghanistan or Tanzania or Sri Lanka or Ethiopia are also getting on the fossil fuel bandwagon. And that is a real problem, because while we know that the climate crisis is somewhat similar to the COVID crisis in that if you act, you prevent yourself from having an enormous amount of trouble, it plays out over longer timescales, as John pointed out. And it turns out that we are really, really good at reacting to threats that seem imminent, such as a pandemic, but really lousy in reacting to threats that seem to be playing out over years to decades to centuries. And to make things worse, you cannot get out of the climate crisis by wearing a mask. There is no magic bullet to the whole thing. So while I don't quite agree with John that we are going all the way to extinction, because extinction means that there's not a single fertile couple left on a planet that currently has 8 billion people, and we are extremely adaptable, unless we go over to Venus. This is a picture of Venus. I do agree with John that unless we rapidly tweak our systems, we are all, and excuse my French, completely and utterly fucked. There is no way that on a planet that wants too much, we can avoid the kind of problem that arises when we have crop failures across all of the world's bread baskets at the same time, and we suddenly have extremely large famines. And while that may not lead to extinction, it is going to lead to war, and it is extremely unpleasant for the people who are going to have to live through it. And these scenarios have been gamed out, and you can even make good money as an author these days if you write a book about it. So is it time to completely panic, or is it time to do what John is intending to do, which is in effect to sit back and meditate and wait for the catastrophe to take over? Well, not quite. I said we need to tweak the system. And one of the easiest things that we need to tweak is agriculture and land use. The original warming that we got was from agriculture and land use. And agriculture and land use is a pretty big chunk of the total. It's difficult to measure exactly, which is why the chart on the left tells you it's about 31%, while the chart on the right tells you it's about 18%. But give or take, it's somewhere between 20 and 30% of total emissions. those emissions you can get rid of entirely, and you can turn that sector, agriculture and forestry, from a net source of greenhouse gas pollution to a net sink. And that is great news, because while there is no silver bullet, there is a magic pizza pie comprised of a whole bunch of activities, and series CCS, which I personally don't believe in too much, will also play a part in there. I hope it works. And the problem with many of these slices is that they cost a lot of money, or they need to change industrial processes, and that all needs to be done. The beauty of regenerative agriculture is that it is so simple. It's not quite a get out of jail free card, but it works at massive scales and around the world. This is an example of it. It's called silvopastoralism, the grazing of ruminants under trees. And the picture at the top right is from Northern Europe. The picture at the bottom right is from the Sahel. The pictures on the left are other European pictures. But the systems are everywhere the same. And if you manage these systems properly, or if you let nature manage these systems properly, they rapidly build up soils. And soils are comprised of carbon that is stable over timescales of years to centuries if you don't destroy them again, if you don't plow them. So here is a tool that you have. You can apply similar principles to arable farming. And here again, you have examples from around the world, from Zambia to Sri Lanka, through England and France. You have the most effective and the most productive agricultural systems ever imagined by man. The polycultures, you have examples here from Tanzania, from Uganda, from Brazil, and from the United States, which typically produce 3 to 5 times more biomass per unit area of land than monocrop farming systems, and do a great job of rebuilding soils as well. And it's not limited to these tree-based systems. You can do the same thing with grasslands management. There's a wonderful paper that came out in Nature just a few days ago that said, in effect, that was massive carbon sink could be obtained if only we transformed pastures into grasslands. I had to stroke my chin because a pasture is an example of a grassland. What they meant, of course, is if you manage your grasslands well. If you manage your grasslands, if you look at the picture on the top left, like the guy on the left rather than the guy on the right. Just by the way, the guy on the left has 10 times more cattle on his land than the guy on the right. Why? Because he needs all that cattle to keep that grassland productive. And you can see that it has an impact on the soil because you see the vehicle tracks. You see vehicle tracks on either side of the fence. The vehicle tracks on the right, you can barely see because the ground has become so hard. There's no carbon left in it anymore. The vehicle tracks on the left have deeply marked the land because the soil is fluffy. It's absorbed carbon, it's absorbing water, and it is far more alive than the soil on the right. And that too is something that you can do as managers. And if you stop to think about it, it's fairly logical. If you only have one plant, a monocrop on your land, then the carbon that you produce, well, you're going to take half of it for food production. You're going to have some of it that stays in the soil for fertility. But the more you put stuff in there, the more likely you are going to be to produce more food and other things you need like timber or fiber, and put more carbon back into the soil. And for grasslands, you have the same kind of idea. I mean, the European Union actually subsidizes what they call improved pastures. And that's what you see at the extreme left there. They are short grasses with very short roots. It's perfect for destroying the climate. It's also really, really bad for resilience, which means you need to use lashings of fertilizers and pesticides to keep the thing working. Whereas the herbs, forbs, and sedges on the right, with these deep rooting systems, are what a permanent pasture can look like, what a permanent grassland can look like with better management. People who try to look at all of these systems at a macro scale, like the IPCC, have recognized this potential. And if you look at the land-based management options that they identify, the two I've just talked about here, agroforestry and improved grazing management, are both not only have, they both not only have an extremely high potential, but they're also very, very cheap to put in place. So this is fantastic. How fantastic is it? Well, that's actually quite difficult to measure, right? Here, for example, is a study that shows that if you did agroforestry in Europe, everywhere it could be done, you could capture 1/3 of all emissions from all European sources. Brilliant, right? Except the error bars on that are absolutely enormous. And there's lots and lots of papers that come to very different conclusions. Why is that? That's because in agroforestry systems, the carbon gets placed further down in the soil. This chart compares on the left the density of rootlets in a forest system, and on the right, the density of rootlets in an agroforestry system. In the agroforestry system, the tree rootlets are much deeper down. And what that means is the carbon is placed much deeper down. But most of the time, when you measure soil carbon, you only measure it on the top 20 centimeters. So you're not capturing these kinds of effects. And if you only measure the top 20 centimeters, in fact, the conclusion you would come to here is that the agroforestry system is worse for the climate than the forestry system. Whereas if you measure the whole depth, and that is expensive, as you can see, you suddenly realize how extraordinarily productive it can be in terms of storing carbon. And that's the fundamental problem. Measuring is really hard. So measures that you get like these, for example, which is from a grassland system, and these are the changes in soil organic carbon in 3 years, in black in 2008, in yellow in 2011, have to be taken with a certain pinch of salt, because it all depends on how you have done the measuring. Which is why a huge effort is now in the way to try to develop good proxy metrics. And here's one that we use at EURAF in African landscapes, where we are using fractional vegetation cover on the left or erosion on the right to try to match it to soil organic carbon. Yes, there is a definite relationship, as you can see, but the graph scatters all over the place. So if you want to build a contract on this, and there's a lot of conversation these days about building contracts to incentivize farmers to capture carbon, doing it is kind of tricky. But leaving all that aside, if you take all of these things into account, you come to a wonderful conclusion. First, the technology bit, the wind turbines, the solar farms, the nuclear power stations, all that accounts for much less drawdown potential than the land bits. And if you just add up all of these land bits, and remember the error bars are large, so it's possible that they're vastly underestimated or overestimated, and you do them consequently, you could get rid of almost 200 parts per million of carbon dioxide that's in the air today. The solution is right there. It's not a magic bullet, it's a magic pizza pie that involves hundreds of millions of farmers slightly changing the way they work. Now, it's spreading. That's the good news. It's spreading. It's rising slowly, but it's rising. And it's rising despite the lack of public support, despite the lack of policy support, despite the lack of subsidies, and in many jurisdictions with governance systems that actively discourage the planting of trees in farming systems. So that's great news. Another bit of great news, of course, is that these systems help with adaptation, because no matter what we do, we are going to have a much hotter planet. We are going to deal with a farming system that's going to have to survive increasingly harsh weather conditions, and management makes all the difference. This is what happens to land when you manage it badly. These were the forest fires 100 years in Portugal. Lots of shrub, lots of brushes, no clearing, or even better, Scots pine plantations. Scots pine burns really well, and when it gets hot, it explodes, and these little bowls of turpentine can be thrown up to 100 feet away to light the trees around it. It's a fantastic way of rapidly destroying a landscape. This is the traditional management system in Portugal as well. It's been going on for thousands of years. It's basically grazing animals on the cork oaks. When the fire comes there, it burns the grass. It doesn't do any damage. Wind is the same thing. There was a natural experiment 10 years ago in Southwest France. And when I call that a natural experiment, it's because Southwest France is the area with the most modern agroforestry systems in the country. When that storm ripped through, it destroyed so much plantation wood that even that wind throw had no value as energy wood anymore, because there was not the capacity to carry it all, dry it all, and turn it into pellets before it started rotting on the spot. It was a net loss for the farmers, and of course a disaster for the climate and biodiversity. This is an agroforestry farm in the same area, and that picture was taken this summer after that particular storm. Those trees are much deeper rooted, they are squatter, they are not forced to grow up like the trees in our plantation, and so they are far more resistant, more resilient to these kinds of weather events. The same thing applies to windstorms. If you don't like them, put down some hedges, or to rainstorms. If you don't like to lose your soil to water erosion, it really helps to contour your land using key lines like these. Finally, trees also help with groundwater recharge. We used to think that forests were really bad for for groundwater recharge, that the water would just disappear in the air. And that is true. When you have too much tree cover, when you have a forest, a lot of evapotranspiration takes place. If you have no trees, most of the water just runs off into the rivers and the seas. When you have an intermediate tree cover, you have the sweet spot you need to be. Now, if this is the future, why does the world look like this? Labor is expensive in our world. Capital is cheap. It's easier to buy a machine than to hire people. And that is something you can easily do with a machine, but not with agroforestry you need people for. Also, we love progress. Who recognizes this city? It's Birmingham. Who recognizes this city? It's also Birmingham. Those two pictures were taken at 20 years difference. And that idea that modernity is going to save us pervaded everything. I used to work in the former Soviet Union. I picked up this poster. It's a poster to extol the virtues of socialist agriculture over capitalist agriculture. All it shows is a pesticide plant, or a fertilizer plant, sorry, and a bunch of tractors. It's in red, no, it's not in green. There's not a single plant in it. We got new toys called pesticides, herbicides, machinery, diesel, improved seeds. And just like a toddler at Christmas will forget all her old toys because she's got the brand new ones, we forgot the old toys. We forgot agroforestry, polycultures, permaculture, and so on, because we could spray our way to salvation. And that has led to this. If you have a farm, I'm going to be making between 50 and I am Syngenta or Bayer or Monsanto, I'm going to be making between $50 and $100 per hectare per year in profit from, in cash flow, excuse me, from your farm. It's a business that's divided amongst 6 or 7 huge companies around the world. So every commercial farmer is feeding that machine. Whereas if instead I advise you how to do agroforestry, you might pay me a small consultancy fee, but it's not scalable. I can't put it in the bag. I have to send somebody out to do it. And there's just no way I can do it. So I can't do any marketing. I can't do any research. I can't buy any influence. And that means, and influence is the most important thing, because this is called conventional agriculture. Traditional agriculture, everybody uses that vocabulary. Excuse me, this is a disaster. It is completely modern. There's nothing conventional and nothing traditional about it at all. Worse, we've polluted our minds. We look at that, and this picture was taken from the website of a seed company. We look at that and we think, oh my God, what a healthy field. It's not. It's monoclonal. It only looks like that for a few months of the year. The rest of the year it's bare. You need lashings of pesticides and herbicides to make it look like that. It's profoundly unhealthy. But we've been so conditioned that when we see this, we think, oh my God, that poor woman, these poor people are so poor. Sorry, in Mesoamerica, these kind of polycropping systems have been keeping high population densities alive and well fed for millennia. But we have to feed the world, and that's perhaps the worst bit of this disaster, which is that you can always close the conversation by saying, but we must feed the world. And that means we must have more calories. And that means we must have better crops that respond better to fertilizers and pesticides and better GMOs and we feed a machine that has destroyed the soils, that is helping to destroy the climate, and that could, with a little bit of effort, become our salvation.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It was very, very interesting. One from Edmund Grace again, who's in question to attempting to convince owners of a large dairy farm with an income of 6 figures in prime land in Ireland, could be anywhere, could be in Belgium, could be anywhere in Western Europe, about the benefits of agroforestry. Where would I begin? May also be picking up 1 or 2 other questions later on not the same theme, but again, in your area of agroforestry. Patrick, please.
Ireland is expected to suffer increasingly from droughts and from heavy rainstorms as climate change starts biting. And so what I would start talking about is the protective effects of trees on livestock. There's beautiful data showing that the availability of shade tends to increase cattle productivity for milk by about 6 to 7%, for example. And if you only have a few scattered trees in your pastures, what you will do is create a lot of muddy land because all the animals are going to congregate under that particular tree. If instead you have alleys of trees, then that effect is spread out, but the animals can all find shade whenever they want it. Depending on the species that you choose, you can also affect your water balance in your land. Ireland is quite wet. You may wish to dry out your land, and trees can be a way of doing that. And of course, you're also going to get two extra benefits. The first is browse. Your cows are going to browse the trees, and that's useful because that provides them with micronutrients that they don't get from grasses, reducing your necessity or your need to buy in extra feed. The second thing that you're going to get from that, of course, is when the trees are mature and they reach the end of their rotation, is timber that you can sell. So it's an additional source of income. So it's a hard financial calculation. You are likely to make more money with to put the trees in, even after you take into account the fact that you've got to pay to change your management system. You've got to learn how to do it, and that is time, and time is money. And you've got to pay to maintain your trees, which is something you didn't have to do before. I hope that answers your question. I always go into these conversations through the financial door. You cannot expect farmers to do stuff unless there's a benefit for them in it.
Okay. I'm just looking at another one from Niels Ruhan under the chat. Question to Patrick Worms: do we need to measure how much CO2 we store, or just how much there is in the atmosphere?
You measure for a purpose. If your purpose is to try to understand how these systems work and how to optimize them for carbon storage, then you do need to measure what's happening in the soil. If your purpose is to reward farmers for storing carbon, then of course you need to measure what happens in the soil. If you measure the simple metric of how much carbon is there in the atmosphere, you're actually not measuring anything at all, because carbon is completely fungible. A molecule of carbon dioxide looks exactly the same whether it came out of a field or whether it came out of a smokestack. So all you're measuring is the total effect of anthropogenic activities, and that's useful because it scares people into acting, but it has no other use in terms of guiding policy.
Okay, there's just another one from also and under the chat from the same person, Niels Poulsen, about, are these techniques which you were talking about, are they being taught yet in agricultural colleges, or is this just thinking still not mainstream?
Very simple. We decided in the 1980s that a lot of the teaching of farmers could be privatized. The private sector could deal with it, which means that now when you go into a farm shop, you receive an enormous amount of advice on seeds, on genetics, on fertilizers, on various kinds of pesticides and herbicides, on machinery, but you receive no advice on ecosystemically aware management. The tools that you get are fantastic. You now get apps on your phone that are going to tell you exactly how much to spray because a disease is coming or locust plague or whatever, and next week you need to have sprayed, and the best time to spray is 3 days down the road, and everything is done to make it easy for you to buy chemicals and use them. Practically nothing is done to teach you how to use trees. Why? We forgot. It takes 3 generations for a practice to disappear. And chemistry rolled over agriculture starting in the interwar years. The last generations who knew how to manage farming without chemistry in the rich world have died out. And now we have to relearn these practices. On top of that, the teaching in the agricultural colleges is heavily predicated on using inputs, not on management. So some countries have tried to turn this around. France is the most prominent example. It launched a massive effort a few years ago to force agricultural colleges and lycées agricoles to start teaching agroecology and agroforestry. And that means it's an example where the private sector got involved. And I'm afraid that is what needs to happen. The public sector has to become involved and take on the responsibility of helping farmers adapt these techniques again.
Okay, thank you for that. There's another one for you, Patrick, from Mel Landers. An average figure of how much carbon might potentially be captured per hectare by converting plowed land to agroforestry.
Yeah, I'm just going to share this this slide again, if I may. There we go. So if you can you see this slide now?
Yes.
Right. So what you see is a number of things that involve trees: regenerative agriculture, temperate forests, tropical stable trees, afforestation, tree intercropping, farmland restoration. All of those have been estimated in terms of their total potential of drawing down carbon. If you add all of that up, all of those things up, and they're not all agroforestry, there's managed grazing in there as well, and there's also protecting natural forests, you get to roughly 430 billion tons of CO2. Today, we're emitting around 42, 43 or 44, I forget what the exact number is, gigatons of CO2 every year. So that's 10 years of emissions. So it's not going to save us. I don't want to give that message, right? Everything else has to decarbonize as well and has to decarbonize as quickly as possible. But it can buy us a little bit of time. And even after everything has been decarbonized, it can do something supremely important, which only this and CCS can do, which is to take the carbon that's already in the atmosphere and get it out of the atmosphere. Now, you can put it underground in CCS, or you can put it to work, creating more life by putting it in soil. And both approaches have a lot of merit. Mel, I hope that answered your question.
Can we just go back to some of the questions which were specifically for CCS? There was one for Kerry, which was feasible to upscale CCS technology as a public good. And would you have a view on that? I think, again, this would just be one of many arrows in a quiver where it's part of a solution, but possibly trying to change human behavior, which John is less sure of, and maybe you're right, John, the less sure can be maintained, but public human behavior does need to be changed.
John is profoundly wrong. This idea that agroforestry is something that's being promoted by some dude sitting in a house in Brussels and that humans are just going to carry on fucking things up, if only I wasn't there with whip, is laughable. It doesn't understand human nature. John, go to Niger, poorest country on earth, a country that suffered from massive famines in the 1980s. You know what happened there? Over 10 million hectares of new agroforestry parklands that grew up. Why? Because it was the only way to grow food. And Miriam, that addresses your question. Agroforestry systems are more productive than extensive systems. They generate more biomass, and a lot of that biomass is food. People do this because they have no choice, right? What we are trying to do is to encourage people to do it before they have no more choice, because it's a lot easier to do this when you have some fat on you, when you can afford to invest, when you're not battling the elements, than to do it when it becomes too late. So you also obviously weren't listening when I showed my slide showing these systems are growing already despite the massive disincentives. Right now, you get penalized for putting a tree in your field across most jurisdictions in the world. Niger, why did these trees grow? What happened? What was the difference there? The difference was that for 5 years, a development NGO negotiated with the Nigerian government to please take the forestry department away from the farmers. Because the forestry department was going in there and finding the farmer if he had the temerity of cutting a few twigs for his kitchen fire, right? You're supposed to have a permit for that. You're supposed to have a permit to cut a tree. You're supposed to have a permit to prune a tree. In a place like Niger, that's completely ridiculous. It's ridiculous enough here, but it's even more ridiculous in that place. So farmers knew perfectly well what would work. And as soon as that yoke was taken off their back, the trees came back. And you see the same thing happening across every single continent. In Europe too. Why is there no agroforestry in Europe? Because your Pillar 1 payments, and I don't know if there's anybody from DG Agri listening here, because for decades, your Pillar 1 payments would simply not take into account the land under the crown of the tree. So the more trees you had, the less money you got paid. So of course you cut the trees, right? It's not that people don't want to act. It's that people are actively being prevented to act by an industrial agricultural mindset that came out of the industrialization of agriculture between the wars, and that we now need to dial back. And the good news is that at the level of policy making, people understand this. Yes, it's a super tanker and you need to turn it around and it takes time, and we don't have the time. I agree with you on that, John. We need to do it much faster than we're doing it already, but at least the trend is moving in the right direction. Will it be enough? Don't know, probably not. I'd quite like to though, because I've got kids.